All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the Liam McCullum Show. Today, I am joined by my friend Ethan Holmes again. I've had him on the show before to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I'm recording today on February 24th, 2023, and it is the one-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. Purposefully said that it was the one-year anniversary of the invasion, not the conflict, and we're about to get into why that is. But for anyone who is watching and is new to the show, please subscribe, give it a like, share it with your friends. Also, if you like this episode, please go back and listen to my interview that I recorded with Darren Gobb on Wednesday. We were discussing the Defend the Guard Act that is going through the Montana legislature this session. And what the Defend the Guard Act will do is it will prevent the national government from nationalizing the Montana Guard for undeclared wars. And he is a retired lieutenant colonel, and he came on to talk about why he supports the Defend the Guard Act. And that hearing is coming up on Monday at 3 p.m. in the Montana legislature. So if you are interested in that, please go back and give that episode a listen. But I'm going to bring in Ethan, and I'm going to have him introduce himself. How are you doing, Ethan?
Good. It's good to see you. Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, thanks for joining again. I've had you on I think, 4 times now? This might be the 5th.
We've had a lot of discussions on a lot of things, obviously mainly this conflict as of late, but always a welcome guest, and you're always a welcome interviewer. So I appreciate it. And I like what you guys are doing with the Defend the Guard Act as well. It's really great legislation. Wish it were, being considered in more places around the country. So I hope we see a success here in Montana for sure.
Yeah, hopefully Montana ends up being the first state to pass it. I know that Arizona just passed it through a committee a couple of weeks ago. So, I mean, they might be the first, but if not, I think Montana actually has a pretty big chance of getting it through. Hopefully the governor will sign it if that's the case. But why don't you just introduce yourself for people who aren't aware of who you are and haven't listened to the previous podcasts?
Yeah, for sure. Well, as Liam has alluded to, I am a Russia specialist. I am a reporter with the Sputnik Newswire, and I have a degree in Russian and political science from the University of Montana, which is where I met Liam originally. My interest in Russia, kind of to give you my own personal background and entry into this subject, began when I had to choose a language kind of at random to study at the University of Montana, which they require for a number of their degrees. And I didn't really feel any sort of connection to, German, Spanish. They're very popular. French is disgusting. Chinese, Arabic sounded a little too hard for me. But I had a friend from a Russian-speaking part of Eastern Ukraine who was an exchange student in high school. And so I just kind of decided to take Russian. I'd have someone to practice with, someone to help, and then a genuine reason to pursue it. It also seemed politically relevant, even at that time in 2016. When I first began studying at the University of Montana, Russia quickly broke into the news cycle because of the election of Donald Trump and all of the Russia collusion stories going on at the time. And so after studying at the University of Montana, graduating, I went to Novosibirsk in the heart of Siberia, the largest city out there, where I taught English for some time, familiarized myself further with the Russian language, culture, society. And I fell in love there in Siberia. With the people and the culture and the history that was just so incredibly rich and so incredibly similar in a lot of ways to how we live here in America. The Russian soul and the American soul, I think, are closer than a lot of people realize. And that's something that I really took home when I eventually came back here due to the circumstances of the pandemic that I don't think can be named here in the YouTube video. I hope this doesn't affect the algorithm. RIP if so, F's in the chat. But that's a long way to say that I eventually ended up reporting on Russia about a couple months ago. And now I'm here. The invasion, the special military operation, as it's referred to in Russia, commenced several months into my work. And I've kind of been covering that as a focus ever since on the national and international levels.
And a year ago, I actually remember I was messaging you as there were reports that Russia began its invasion. And the weeks prior were pretty interesting because I remember being pretty doubtful that an invasion was about to happen. I thought that a lot of it was just, the military-industrial complex and a lot of congressmen, trying to start some drama there and potentially get us in a position where they could send more aid to Ukraine or aid to Taiwan. So I didn't think that there was anything really about to happen, but I was aware of the political situation there, and that the Biden administration was sending missiles to Ukraine that Putin had serious problems with, and that we had exited some treaties, some nuclear treaties during the Trump presidency, which Putin complained about. But now that it is the 1 year anniversary of the invasion, I think that it might be important to give it some context and really question whether it's accurate to frame this as the 1 year anniversary of the war, because we're seeing a lot of that in the press right now. And I intentionally named this podcast the 1 year anniversary of the Ukraine invasion because, I sent out a tweet this morning saying that the reality is that there has been a civil war in Ukraine since 2014. So I'm curious if you can just reflect on that and take that where you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any worthwhile understanding of this conflict, its parties, its players, the dynamics at hand, relies on a really strong understanding of the historical context. And like you said, we were living together actually at the time as roommates when the invasion first happened. And I remember sitting there in our kitchen watching the UN Security Council hold an emergency meeting on the matter. And I was likewise taken by surprise. Even as someone who was covering the buildup, the US's repeated warnings, I was not at all entirely confident that Russia was going to make any sort of major play on Ukraine despite the buildup. So I will be the first to admit that I was mistaken there in my analysis. But ever since, I think what's been most important is getting out information about how we got to that point, February 24th, 2022, 1 year ago. Because as you mentioned and made very clear, the conflict didn't just start 1 year ago today. The conflict goes back to 2014 by some people's standards, years before that by others. And the tension and the dynamics of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship really go back to the founding of the state of Ukraine, or even the founding of the Kievan Rus hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We've gone over these topics, the historical context, more in depth in previous episodes. I would absolutely suggest people go and listen to those if they ever have a keen interest in the subject. But long story short, Russia and Ukraine are distinct people and entities, but there's a lot of interconnectedness linguistically, culturally, historically. The Kievan Rus, founded by Prince Vladimir the Great, were exactly that, Kievan. They were founded in the city of Kiev. And he baptized the Russian people as Christian. That kind of marks the founding of the Kievan Rus. But eventually, over time, the center of power of the Kievan Rus, and their successors, shifted to different places. At some times it was in Novgorod, at some points it was in Moscow, at others it was in St. Petersburg, which came much, much later, Leningrad, as it was renamed in the Soviet era, shifted back to Moscow in the Soviet era as well. So there's a long history of the center of power of the Russian people shifting. Moreover, you have the Soviet connection of Ukraine and Russia existing as separate entities within a united Soviet state. And the boundaries, the territories of Ukraine shifted in this time under the Soviet Union. They were gifted, for example, the Crimean Peninsula, which had not until that point been definitively considered part of any Ukrainian entity. And then you have the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then you have the situation where Ukraine wants security guarantees as a newly independent state. Russia, steps in, and they have this new kind of defeated humiliation as now a second-tier world power, and their rise back up, trying to get up the ranks. They're vying for both power and influence, and sovereignty as a state, which, at least by its own perception, is existentially threatened by NATO expansion and enlargement. So that's the best I can do, kind of hundreds and hundreds of years, grand synopsis, 30,000 feet of Russo-Ukrainian relationships leading into this. I think it'd be worthwhile doing a deeper dive in the more recent years, 2008, 2014, up until 2022, and we saw the launch of the special military operation. But I hope that answers at least the broad context foundational setting here for why this conflict is a conflict extending years and not simply a year, as has largely been portrayed in Western media, celebrated even as 1 year.
Yeah, I had a friend who joked that today seemed like a holy war for the regime. If you followed a lot of the news articles, and I would have to agree. I mean, some people were really gloating over the fact that it almost that they were celebrating the fact that they were able to continue to send weapons to weapons manufacturers. Almost is the motivation that I cynically believe is driving a lot of that. But for anyone who
saw the binding of religious fervor to this conflict among a largely secular group of the population, may I add, when they started making such as Saint Javelin memes and the like. I'm not one to criticize people for odd artistic expressions of their ideals and interests, but it is certainly strange to be trying to canonize and sanctify violent warfare. There's a dissonance there for sure.
Yeah, and for anyone who didn't see this yesterday, actually NATO tweeted out that they were comparing this conflict to Harry Potter, to Dune, to Star Wars. It was pretty ridiculous. I mean, this is something that I've been saying for a long time, is that it's like they're living through a crappy liberal war film, and like it's almost from the same spirit of like kind of Marvel movies, where they really think that at the end of this conflict, everyone will, assemble, Avengers will assemble, and they'll be able to simply just defeat Russia. And I just don't think that that's an accurate assessment. And it's really downplaying the power of that country, and also the potential allies that it has in a larger conflict. We're seeing that Russia is actually being pushed in the direction of China, and there's this economic brick system, and Saudi Arabia is actually about to join it, I think. So it's just naive to think that this war is in a vacuum, where the U.S. just can roll through and regime change Russia, which seems to be a lot of politicians' goals in this conflict, especially if you look at like Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell. I mean, they'll say as much, that they hope Putin oversteps so someone can get involved and take Putin out, I think is how Lindsey Graham put it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and avoiding escalation is one of the most important things that should be foremost on the mind of any serious statesman or diplomat. We all understand, we all really do know the risks of escalating this conflict beyond how it currently stands. Bringing a peer-to-peer clash between NATO and Russia, potentially dragging in other major powers like China, Iran, North Korea, it would be a third world war, as many people have labeled it. That can definitely sound cliche or even hyperbolic, but in this case, it truly isn't. We would see two clashing global coalitions who will both get dead set in a sunk cost fallacy. We kind of hear that sort of thinking already from Biden, the State Department. He said earlier that the cost at this point of walking away would be far higher than if we continue just spending and spending as long as this conflict will take. Well, that's not proper logical thinking right there. That's not an accurate way to be doing that cost benefit analysis. And I think that's what's really intuitively understandable to a lot of the American people right now. The 1 year anniversary in a lot of people's minds has sparked a sort of reflection point, almost like when you get into a 1 year anniversary of a relationship. You have to ask yourself, is this something that I'm willing to commit to? Is this a marriageable relationship? Or am I simply stringing along, wasting time, ultimately setting up for something that's going to be greater heartbreak, much messier than it would have been had it been nipped in the bud shortly, right? And that's a scary sort of ultimatum position to have to be in, whether we totally abandon or totally buckle down. Because treading a middle ground in a lot of people's mind doesn't seem sustainable. we can't just keep having a proxy war against a player that's getting increasingly frustrated with the level of assistance that's being given to this proxy. And so on this 1-year anniversary of the invasion, I would really implore people to think about it in those terms. Are we willing to commit to this relationship truly, wholeheartedly, 100%? Are we willing to risk the life of America? You know, in a marriage, you're willing to risk your life for that person that you're marrying. I think similarly, that's how we should think about our international relations. If we're really willing to bind ourselves to a country, we have to be willing to say, as America, this is an existential cause for us. We are willing to dissolve ourselves as a nation if it pays the price for Ukraine. And I think a lot of Americans absolutely aren't in that mindset. I wouldn't blame them. I certainly am not. I think any rationally minded person who has not been either thoroughly brainwashed or totally bought out by the powers that be hold that position. That is not to say that I think everyone who is a fervent supporter of Ukraine is propagandized into the position and simply doesn't understand it. There are certain people who I absolutely respect who hold firm to the principle of self-defense, that this, even regardless of any sort of provocation or other circumstances regarding NATO and Russia, that you can never justify this invasion. I'm very sympathetic to that position. I hold it myself, that you really can't justify any sort of violent action just as a libertarian ethical principle. But to pretend as though the larger actions of NATO and the West, the larger dynamics that have been at hand for the last 2-3 decades between Russia and the West, to pretend as though those aren't relevant and that those haven't been pushing towards where we are now, to where we ended up a year ago today, it's simply foolish. It's dishonest to think that way. So as people listen to this conversation, as they kind of soak in what we're at already, I hope that they've reached that point where they can recognize that if we back away from both players, from both meta narratives that are battling each other in this conflict, the only things that really matter are avoiding escalation and reaching peace sooner rather than later. Either making a definitive choice that we are a nation and a people of peacemakers, or we are a nation and a people of war makers, of warmongers. So I think I know where you stand as well, Liam. But as a Montanan here in the nuclear sponge, I know that we have a particular worry about this issue and its outcome.
Yeah, and that's a reference to a testimony that I made in front of a Montana legislative committee a couple of weeks ago, where I made the case that it's really not in our interest to escalate this war, because there is a serious risk here that this could bubble over into World War III or a nuclear conflict. And our own national intelligence director, she said that if Putin feels that his regime is being threatened, or if he is about to lose the war, he may launch nukes. And unfortunately, because of our triad nuclear system in the United States, we have sea-based missiles, we have ground-based missiles, and then we have long-range missiles. And these ground-based missiles are a part of the nuclear sponge, and many of them are located in Montana and the surrounding states. And literally the intended purpose of these missiles are to soak up a nuclear strike. The idea is that if they wanted to launch a preemptive strike on a larger city like Austin or DC, they would have to launch enough sufficient to, take out any of the nukes that are potentially launched from Montana. So in a lot of the, they have these like videos of like a simulation of how nuclear war will play out. And Russia, launches one into Ukraine and then immediately launches into Europe, and then we respond. And then in these simulations, you'll see that they end up in the Northwest. And it's like, that's why. But for people who are curious about the background, and want to go deeper and look at maybe how this conflict has evolved since the 90s, I have an interview with Benjamin Avalo, who came on the show to talk about his book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine. And he makes the case that, it's not just NATO expansion that is often what people say. It is also the fact that the United States has left many treaties over the years. It left the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and then it left the Open Skies Treaty in 2020, and then there's one more. The INF Treaty in 2018, I believe, that Trump pulled us out of.
I'm not clear on that, but that sounds right.
Yeah, so it's the INF Treaty, I think, which restricted the amount of intermediate range missiles that could be placed, and that's one of Putin's contentions here, is that these longer range missiles are being pushed closer and closer to Russia's border within Ukraine. And in Putin's speech the other day, he actually said, like, the closer that these missiles get to our border, the further he'll have to push back. So I'm curious if we can go into where things currently stand in the war, just to kind of give some perspective, because I think that a reality here is that the longer the United States takes to actually push for negotiations, the more Ukrainians will die. They'll continue to be used as cannon fodder. And this is something that was actually popularized, a narrative that was popularized by Elon Musk. He said, the outcome of this war is the same. It will be the same as it could have been in February if we prolong this war into another year. The reality is that Ukraine will likely lose this war, and we need to actually sit down, push Putin and Zelensky to the table, and negotiate peace and have no preconditions. And the longer we wait, the more Ukrainians will die. So I'm just curious if, one, you can respond to that. Maybe I have that wrong. Maybe you disagree. And then just explain where things stand currently, and maybe the amount of casualties we're seeing in Ukraine. I think that will give a lot of perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to second your recommendation of your interview on how the West brought war to Ukraine. It's really a phenomenal piece. And just to kind of fill in that gap there between the very, very abbreviated, broad historical lead-in and more contemporary issues like might be brought up in that book, two really critical moments are going to be, one, the "niet means niet" memo, which really, nowadays especially, has to make us wonder whether peace is even the goal here at play. Because in 2008, then ambassador to Russia, William Burns, who's now the director of the CIA, mind you, sent a memo to all the heads of government, heads of the U.S. government at the time, and essentially informed them, "Niet means niet" on Russia's end. No means no. And what the memo laid out is how Russia perceived and understood NATO expansion and enlargement, particularly in Georgia and Ukraine, as matters of significant security concern. They viewed it, as I've said, as a potential existential risk to the Russian nation, to Russian sovereignty, to their ability to keep themselves defended as weapons and forces and integrated militaries encroached closer and closer and closer to their border. Now, it's often called whataboutism to say, well, what if this happened to the US in this circumstance? But it's a useful thought experiment nonetheless. And we've actually seen it happen with the Cuban Missile Crisis. When other military blocs, when other rival powers start placing military equipment in allied forces, start sharing technology that trickles closer to our borders, we kind of flip the fuck out. And understandably so. It's not like I'm saying we should have just remained calm during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but these issues are certainly sensitive ones from either side. And to pretend as though you're only allowed to be offended by encroaching military forces, but not someone else, is kind of the crux of the issue here. There are words thrown around very often by different people with different agendas, but unipolar and multipolar perspectives of how the world order should operate is really something that's a major theoretical issue at hand in this conflict. Whether we should try and have security through a unified, integrated bloc such as NATO and the US, which slowly and slowly expands its hegemony across the globe until there's no reason to fight because everyone's under the same umbrella, versus the multipolar perspective, which seeks to have independent, either regional or localized blocks of power that all cooperate, negotiate, and interact with each other as kind of a confederacy of players, as opposed to a federation of the globe. And although I'm certainly not wholly sympathetic, to the Chinese government, to the Russian government, to the Iranian, North Korean government, their point about expanding U.S. NATO hegemony and what it implies for the world order, that is, that would be unipolar under them, is understandably a threat to their sovereignty. They don't view themselves as being able to be independent peoples, independent cultures, nations, uh, uh, localized governments able to operate under this globalist unipolar system. Uh, and so going back to this 2008 Niet means Niet memo, we were warned over over a decade ago that this was a very real concern of Russia, and that if we continued to pursue a foreign policy of NATO enlargement and expansion, conflict and significant conflict at that was a very, very real risk. Now, at no point in that time, since the Niet means Niet memo and its eventual leak, it was classified, it was leaked by WikiLeaks. At no point did we steer away from this foreign policy of provoking the bear, so to speak, of poking this Ukrainian nerve, this thorn in their side. And we got the answer that we kind of expected, that we were warned by Burns would happen. The Niet means Niet memo, in a very summarized form, is the US saying, if we expand NATO, we are fucking around. And the likelihood that we find out is high. And that's where we ended up a year ago today, is we found out. And another important point before we can move on here to like the current state of the battlefield in Ukraine is to note a figure that's also been mentioned, like you said, by people like Elon Musk, by Trump personally, by a number of Congress people, is Victoria Nuland, our current Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, kind of a low-key position that actually has a lot of power. She was former U.S. ambassador to NATO as well, kind of a long-term, deep state, militaristic crony. And she, as has been pointed out, has been pushing for this conflict more than almost any other person. Her and Secretary of State Antony Blinken in particular are huge proponents of this conflict and seemingly have zero concern about nuclear conflict, about the broader implications of an expanding third world war. And it's incredibly disappointing to know that our leaders had the knowledge, they had the foresight, they had the proper analysis at their fingertips of how to play this out in the safest and most diplomatic way possible. And it seems that at every single corner, they chose to provoke instead of to cooperate, to negotiate, to reach any sort of middle ground settlement. Now, of course, you can't just appease every other power. You know, that's not the essence of multipolarity either. It's all about sincere, authentic engagement. And one of the major critiques that Russia and Putin has made of Western leadership is a lack of sincerity and authenticity in their word, in their actions, in performative contradictions, and hypocrisy. And no government, obviously, is free of those sins. They're governments at the end of the day, but they're valid points when you yourself are, casting these stones. You know, the U.S. has a giant stick in its own eye and is trying to get flecks out of others, which is just an unfortunate morality to be following here when it comes to foreign relations. And it's why we continue to have, to this very day, people dying needlessly on the battlefield.
Yeah, and a point that I've been trying to make is that the reason you're starting to see third world countries or developing countries fall in line almost and start to kind of accept this new order that is kind of emerging on the international scene of like this BRIC system is because the US has really put Putin in a position where he can grandstand, because they have gone around and they have toppled Libya, they have toppled the Iraqi government. They're attempting to do the same in Syria. So they're really putting, our quote unquote enemies in a position where they can point these examples out and say, don't we need an alternative? And so if you really do think that Putin and Xi are, threats to the United States, and I don't really adopt that line of thinking, but if you were to, you're kind of putting them in a position where they're all going to get behind each other. And I think that's actually what we're seeing in this alliance. And we saw that Putin actually met with a high-ranking diplomat from China the other day. And to your point about peace, the CIA director, the fact that the current CIA director was the ambassador, was he the ambassador to Russia when he leaked
U.S. ambassador to Russia?
Yeah, the fact that he acknowledged that this was a red line and he is currently falling in line behind the Russia or the narrative that we're seeing come out of the Biden administration that we really do need to defeat Russia so that they're unable to do what they did in Ukraine again. shows that maybe they aren't interested in peace. And I wonder if you think that maybe there are some ulterior motives. And this actually goes to a question that we got submitted by Wyatt LaPrame. And he's wondering if the U.S. were to go long term in this proxy war, will it benefit the taxpayers or ultimately the pockets of career politicians? Or is this the U.S. living the glory days of Cold War thinking? And I think that that's very related. I'm curious if maybe peace isn't their interest here. And we saw that I think it was the German foreign minister said that what's at risk here is the international order. So it's clear that they're kind of more interested in kind of unipolarity and having hegemony on a world stage. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, lots of great tangents to go on here, and to kind of I'm going to segue this into Wyatt's question. But you mentioned Libya, and this will be a good point of where we can highlight the financial interests of this war for the United States. This is something that I don't think gets quite enough attention, but is certainly a major contributing factor to the United States and the broader Western world's motives here. And that's the fact that the US would like the world to run entirely on the dollar, because that's largely, entirely really, what gives the dollar its strength, right? I know you have a bunch of libertarians, mostly, probably entirely libertarians listening to this stream. And so they well understand fiat versus backed currencies and how the US dollar works, Federal Reserve, central banking, all that. So I'm going to skip all the basics and just get to the point that those are all fundamental to the US's war aims, not just in supporting this proxy war against Ukraine, but in a number of these examples that powers like Russia point to, like the US intervening in Libya, where, say anything else that you want to about Gaddafi as a dictator. But a large part of what made the U.S. mad about his policy was trying to pursue a broader, regional or global economic system that could be separated from the economics of the United States dollar and trading, particularly oil, in this United States dollar. Now, Russia and BRICS, as you've mentioned, as kind of as an alliance there, China as well, they have all been seeking and looking to expand and bolster networks of trade that are outside of the United States dollar. When a lot of these sanctions get imposed, a lot of what it does is it limits Russia and Western companies' ability to do business with Russia by not allowing them to transact through these U.S. financial network systems and in the United States dollar. But at the same time, this forces and pushes Russia to develop this ulterior system. That's where Russia is projected to do better than the UK in this next year economically. They're expected to have more growth than you would have expected from a country under such severe sanctions. The reason being that Russia, for some time now, has been trying to build up a sanction-resilient economy by separating itself from the necessity of using the United States dollar for global trade. Now, the more nations that separate from this global economic hegemony of the US dollar and the trade that it facilitates, that's a risk to US hegemony and NATO military security hegemony overall. If you don't have the gold to back up your steel really means very little. And so I wanted to just highlight that point really quickly, that there are financial grand motives at play here when the US intervenes in conflicts, and particularly as it tries to maintain a global economic system and world order underneath the US dollar and the NATO umbrella. Now, for the US taxpayer, this is not an ideal situation, as I'm sure you've concluded yourself listening already. We continue to pump money, print more money, authorize more expenditures from Congress, more presidential drawdowns, more pulls from our own military stocks. And we're continually draining ourselves in the gamble, in the hope that we come out on top in this proxy conflict. In which case we get all the, Keynesian logic bidding to invest in the rebuilding of Ukraine, building this new cyber tech hub in a destroyed country. You get to kind of do a new Marshall Plan. All these big companies, BlackRock, will get a chunk of the pie. Meanwhile, all throughout the conflict as it extends, the only players really benefiting are those in the military industrial complex, those developing the tanks, the armored vehicles, the drones, the missiles getting sent to Ukraine. And the people who then have to restock the US stockpiles are those same companies, oddly enough. So there's an incentive there. to send the people. Why would we drain our stockpiles? Well, because we get to pay for new stockpiles, and that makes certain people particularly happy. But for the US taxpayer, they should not be happy, because if we come out on the bottom of this proxy conflict, if we pull out too late, if we don't manage to reach a peaceful negotiated settlement in the proper way, we are just going to start bleeding and hemorrhaging, and there will be no way to recover it, because we will have lost any good faith and any remaining ties to a resilient global economic system. We will have to totally rework how our political and economic systems operate in the wake of a disastrous proxy conflict of this scope. And so that's where I circle back to this anniversary as a moment of reflection about whether we are willing to marry the US and its existence to Ukraine, or whether we have to find a way to negotiate a breakup here in this, love triangle, so to speak, with Russia, Ukraine, and ourselves, the collective West. And the taxpayer, the longer it takes us to figure out, the larger a check they may have to write should we most likely fail.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a serious concern here, just considering, everything from the CARES Act as Trump left office, where he, passed one of the largest spending bills in history that has contributed to a lot of the inflation we're seeing. Whether there's a serious reality that this is just kind of a Hail Mary attempt to save the fiat system on a global stage. And if they fail, we could be living through a system. If they choose to default through more inflation, we could be living through a Venezuelan type system where we have hyperinflation, especially if on the global stage we start to see the ruble outperform. And I think that is a serious concern, because Saudi Arabia is actually, I think they are allowing oil to be pegged by the ruler, or by the ruble. I think they are allowing it to be priced in the ruble and sold in the ruble. So if that's really what this is about, it could mean, very serious things, and it could have serious consequences for the lifestyle of the average American. And I'm very concerned about it. And it didn't have to be this way either. The United States could have been going around and being, the shining city on a hill that the founders said we should be. And we should not, we shouldn't have been getting involved in the foreign affairs of other countries, and we should have been trading with them, because really, I think that the best thing that we could do is export our culture, create things here, export our culture, and be that shining city on a hill, be an example to these countries that are tyrannical, try to incentivize trade to these countries, meet with, North Korea and negotiate potentially sending American goods to this country, so that they might be more willing to be peaceful with the United States in the future, or something like that. That is a reality where we actually aren't threatened, where we don't have China or Russia being significant threats to the United States. But I think our own actions have put us in a position where we are going to be weakened financially. So it actually does start to look like we're also threatened in a foreign policy sense too, because we haven't backed away from this policy of waving a big stick around in the Middle East in particular. And now we're trying to extend that policy into Europe, and it's very concerning.
You're very very right, Liam. And one of the saddest parts of this whole thing, right, is that the same people that we would be sending to go die in war and taking away their futures, are the same exact people whose futures and livelihoods we take away through this risky economic supplying proxy war, right? The more that we spend and spend away, the more of a destabilized economic system we create for the United States, the more we build ourselves up in this giant Ponzi scheme. It's not the old people, it's not who are going to have to live through the hardest of the consequences, who are going to have to strive to rebuild in the wake of the destruction. It's the younger generation who would also be sent out on boats, on airplanes into war to die there and have their futures taken away. And so to pretend as though a proxy war of this scope and scale can't be just as destructive in certain ways to the livelihoods and future of young people of a country, it's mistaken. There is a price being paid. The Biden administration really likes to tout how they're confident, but the vast majority of Americans out there are entirely sure that this is the right move, that they're even willing to know that there's consequence and sacrifice and negative outcomes, and they're still willing to do it anyway. That's not the sentiment that I hear. That's not the sentiment I hear widely among common apolitical people, among talking heads in private. But by the sound of what you hear from the administration and its talking heads and spokespeople, you would think the average American is sitting there waving a yellow and blue flag on a daily basis, throwing dollar signs like like they're at a stripper. It's degrading to picture the average American as having that sort of foreign policy mindset. We know very well, it's a fact. Americans like to complain about the amount of foreign aid that we give out because it's a lot, but it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of our budget. That is a valid point that is made to counter that argument. But nevertheless, the American sentiment against that tiny fraction of the budget is remarkably negative across the board, which is why it's all the more frustrating that an administration, knowing this is a political fact, continues to lie blatantly to the Americans in hopes that they will eventually adopt that belief. If you repeat it enough to them, eventually people will start to believe it. In this case, I don't think enough of the American public believes it to have this be a solid national war effort, because we've seen what happens when Americans really, really care about a war and a conflict. We know that America can become the iron giant almost overnight when a conflict worthy of its full attention really arises. And we can just tell that this isn't a conflict that fully rouses America's spirit. It's called a self-defense and action to defend itself and its existence. It doesn't meet that scale. So why are we depriving ourselves, sending out these resources to deplete ourselves just as though we were sending flesh and blood to go die? It's a shame. And to kind of, I know we want to talk about the current kind of where the battlefield stands right now in Ukraine. And I've mentioned this before on your podcast, but the fog of war isn't remarkably thick. Even with all the GoPros out there, all the drones that are hovering in the sky, all the footage that we get sent, it's a fraction of the reality. It's clipped and snippeted. And truly, unless you are there smelling the blood and sulfur and, burning everything in the air on the battlefield, it's hard to definitively say that you know what's going on there. And the wide array of casualty counts and estimates that we see around are reflective of just how thick this fog of war is, of how strong information operations are on both sides. So it's important to note that the Ukrainian government isn't particularly transparent in providing their own battlefield casualty figures, for understandable reasons, although it is rather opaque. But as for Russian figures, even there is discrepancy among major powers, even in the West. So I have some quick notes written down here. The UK Defense Ministry recently said that they estimate around 60,000 killed Russians, 200,000 total casualties. So that includes injured, prisoners of war, anyone who's taken out of the conflict for one reason or another. Now, Ukrainian estimates go way beyond that. They more than double the number of killed and claim about 146,000 killed Russians and approximately 600,000 casualties total for Russia, which is just astronomical. It's 3 times higher as a casualty count than the UK represents. So either the UK is really, really low in their estimate, or Ukraine is really, really, really inflating the numbers of killed Russians. Other Western intelligence analysts put it at about 150K casualties total for both sides. The US has previously said that they think the ratio is about 1 Russian to 1 Ukrainian taken off the battlefield. When they said that, they said it was about 100,000 on each side, but it's been several months since then. And as for some insight into potential Ukrainian numbers, there was a supposed, I got to emphasize that, supposed Mossad Israeli intelligence report that Turkish media reported on, which claimed that Ukraine had about 150,000 killed and over 200,000 wounded, which is higher than a lot of the estimates that you would hear if they were just comparable to the Russians. but also not outside the realm of the possibility. Once again, perhaps Ukraine is correct and way more Russians are dying than we know and than Western intelligence is aware of. Perhaps Ukraine is inflating and the West is inflating and they're lower, but it's really impossible to know. Anyone who claims that they have super in-depth, accurate information is deluding themselves or actively lying to you, because that's just not how things of this scale work. Especially when you're not there personally on the ground, you're not handling the dog tags coming back, the remains. It's just really tough to make any sort of definitive statement. That being said, in a strategic and tactical point of view here, we're kind of at a fixed front in the east of Ukraine there, largely in the Donbass region, as well as some minor operations in the south of the country, there by the Crimean Peninsula, the city of Kherson. It's been largely compared to World War I style fighting, where you have fixed positions, entrenchments, lots of artillery, rocket barrages to soften targets up before you send people in. Because that's kind of the crux of warfare, right? Eventually, you always have to send people in. And that's one of the major concerns that even the most ardent pro-Ukrainian supporters have expressed, is that Russia simply has more numbers. They can continue to mobilize, and you have to send in troops to defend. It doesn't matter how many HIMARS, how many Humvees, how many tanks you have. If you don't have bodies to operate them, you simply lose. That's the nature of warfare. And although I admit there would be problems in trying to mobilize a ton of Russian forces, simply as a matter of mathematics, it would be remarkable for Ukraine to be able to win a war of attrition, as these World War I type conflicts tend to boil down to, which is why we're hearing both sides are supposedly preparing for almost simultaneous counteroffensives against one another.
Yeah, I have a question about that. What is like the mobilization capability of Russia right now? I know that they, the last time we talked, they were beginning a partial mobilization and I think a partial draft. But like, if this were to go to full scale war, where are we at relative to that? So like, how far can they go?
Particularly close. Russia has hundreds of thousands of more soldiers it could send into conflict, theoretically. Once again, you never know exactly how many young men you can take from a society before you start seeing revolts and rebellion. But safe to say there are hundreds of thousands more troops that could possibly be called up by Russia, which is far more than Ukraine could possibly call up, especially with many of the country's young men and a lot of their women and children having left the country and expressed in polls no desire to return. It was remarkable. I can't remember exactly the figures, but a significant number of Ukrainian refugees who have left for countries such as Germany have expressed zero intention of returning to Ukraine, which is a frightening prospect for a post-war Ukraine if you're looking to rebuild, because much like war needs flesh and blood bodies to be waged, so too does any sort of reconstruction effort. And Russia, of course, will have a similar problem. It already had some demographic concerns, as many nations in the world do today. And sending young men to die and having women leave your country out of fear doesn't help with demographic issues. That is for sure. So, yes.
Yeah, and along that line, I think it was Colonel Douglas McGregor. He had made the point that like Ukraine, like it's totally feasible that entire, years or classes of Ukrainians, like potentially men born in the year of 1999, have either left the country or been wiped out entirely. And this is partially why they have needed to extend the draft to people who 16 and older. So, I mean, that is a serious concern here too, that Ukrainians or Russians outnumber Ukrainians significantly. And you can continue to send weaponry to Ukraine, but it won't matter if there aren't any young Ukrainians to man that weaponry.
Exactly. It's a really unfortunate but unavoidable fact of warfare, is that you're going to only have a set number of men, of people willing to go out there, able to go out there and fight and wage in these wars, whether they want to or not. And yes, you're entirely correct. Russia does just have the mathematical advantage here, and a mathematical advantage goes a long ways. to expand a little bit more on this question of what would total war look like, I always implore people in the West to talk to someone from Eastern Europe about World War II, particularly from the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War is what they called it, because it is as close to the total war mobilization of society as you're going to get. You have a lot of that in World War II, a lot of as close to total war as we've really ever seen. But the Soviet Union took it to the real extremes of what's occurred on this planet. You look at things like the 900+ day siege of Leningrad and what the Soviet people went through there. The absolute massive death toll from battles like Stalingrad. The Eastern Front in general was insanely bloody, way more so than the Western Front, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention in Western media, just how large the effort was. And similarly, the thing that reminded me of this is when you talk about entire classes of men being wiped out, you saw that in the Soviet Union, in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, in the Great Patriotic War, in World War II, where men born in the years 1938, who turned 18 in the years like 1938, 1939, those generations were like 80-90% wiped out in some cases. And I know this isn't the focus of the conversation, but with this larger aging demographic crisis in the West, losing that significant chunk of young people is an even more real concern now than it was in the past. So definitely something to keep in mind and consider as we ponder why peace is so important. If we want to have countries that are able to come out of this conflict with the capacity to recover, you can only stretch them so thin and so far, but before someone else has to move in, so to speak. So in terms of peace, it's a critical question.
Yeah. Now, earlier we talked a little bit about the motivations for peace and whether that is really actually what's driving U.S. officials. And it seems like, especially with Blinken and Nuland, they have, personal investments in this. Nuland's been involved in this conflict since 2014 when her phone call was leaked. So we briefly touched on that, but I'm curious if we can just get into actually. So we talked about like the motivations here and whether people want peace, but can we get into like the prospects of peace and whether you think it's possible? Because, I'm a little cynical. I think that it's clear that certain parties within the Biden administration are not interested and do not want to ease up at all. But at the same time, you get other parties that are expressing that maybe we need to shift gears and focus more on the Asian Pacific. So that's scary in itself that people want to focus on Taiwan and China. But, half of the administration, at least, that are involved in military decisions seem totally invested, even though Biden himself has expressed that he doesn't want to send men and women to Ukraine. A little less than a year ago, he also said that he didn't want to send tanks to Ukraine. He said that would be enough to spark World War III. And here we are sending tanks. And I do know that timeline is a little questionable. Like those tanks might not get there for a while. But now there are conversations about sending fighter jets. And I know that it's unlikely at this point, but there seems to be a pattern where we say that we're not going to do something. We take 3 steps back and de-escalate kind of, or maybe we don't even take steps back. It's just that we wait a while and then we take 2 steps forward. So I'm wondering what you think, where you think this is headed, because I'm pretty terrified. Just when you consider the element of human error and the amount of examples throughout history where we have been very near to nuclear conflict. Like I always forget the guy's name, but the guy who manned the submarine in the
Soviet admiral.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember his name exactly either, but I know the story that you're speaking. There's several such cases of nuclear officers miraculously stopping accidental nuclear conflict.
Yeah, and then there are many examples where drills being held within the United States, and they accidentally drop it in a river. I think it was in Georgia. There was an example that there was a nuclear weapon dropped in a river, and it still hasn't been found. So like there are serious things to consider here, and the element of human error where, if they're holding a military drill or something and it goes wrong, and Russia perceives it as a nuclear threat because they don't have the same nuclear detectable systems. We can tell if a nuke was launched at any point in the world, but Russia has an outdated system, as I understand it. So there are many times where they've gotten false alerts, and they don't launch nukes in response because they're just betting on the fact that it's a false alarm. So that's a lot to throw at you, but I'm curious what you think.
No, it's a coherent set of concerns and questions. And so just to start on, it's hard not to be cynical about prospects for peace. I think you're right. However, there are a couple pathways, potential avenues that we could take to at least get to solid ground and start working on the issue. First, we see a not insignificant movement within the United States Congress, particularly among House Republicans, to audit, to end, to be more skeptical, to be more hesitant, to be sending blank checks, as they've put it, to Ukraine for the foreseeable future, right? Because they are representative of this not insignificant portion of the American public who has realized that this has the potential to backfire, that it is not very clearly in their interest. And so, although they have been kind of cast off as insignificant, as this very minor group of radicals in Congress, they are representative of a much larger slice of the American public than it would seem by their presence in Congress. And I'm sure there are many more lawmakers who are equally or at least slightly skeptical of endless aid for the future, who are simply afraid to speak up for fear that they lose political capital, influence, potentially small segments of their hyper liberal bases by expressing very real, rational, logical concerns economically, in terms of foreign policy, about continued involvement in this conflict. In terms of the Biden administration, I don't see many glimmers of hope, particularly among them in the State Department, the Pentagon, the White House. They seem rather hellbent. They do seem rather committed and dedicated, as they've said, to being here as long as it takes. And that's a big commitment. Once again, that's a marriage. You are saying forever when you say that, potentially.
And it's important to ask, because they always say it without context. They don't clarify what the actual U.S. policy is towards Russia. But thankfully, we've had Lloyd Austin and Blinken say it a few times. Their policy is to defeat Russia and weaken them so that they're unable to do what they did in Ukraine again. So, the fact that they're saying we will keep at this for as long as it takes. If you're right that they can, draft hundreds of thousands of more men, how long will that take? How many years is that going to take? And how long will Putin stand by without launching a tactical nuke in Ukraine? I don't know. It's terrifying.
Well, they're very reasonable questions. Once more, the further on this conflict drags, particularly the further along it drags in this very awkward proxy war state, the higher the risk of escalation and the consequences of that escalation become, which is why it's so important to start reflecting on these important questions now, because they are tough choices. They are hard just to make overnight. They take time and nuance. But if you never begin to think about them, you're never going to reach them, right? Which is kind of the problem, is that there are so few voices with legitimate diplomatic power who are working on actual sincere peace initiatives. We saw recently China, as you've pointed out, has proposed a peace plan for Ukraine. Very broad, abstract, theoretical points about state sovereignty and the right of nations, the importance of cooperation, those sorts of things. But for the most part, you can agree with the vast majority of the statements made there just on the basis of violence being undesirable and cooperation being desirable. It's really, albeit from China, it's a rather libertarian point being made in terms of foreign policy, at least non-interventionist, in line with their more multipolar view of how the world system should work, even if you don't think that it's a sincere proposal, which is kind of the criticism that has been made is, does China really even mean it? If the same proposal were made about Taiwan, let's say, would they be so keen on these values that they're expressing? I think it's a very valid question to make, but it doesn't detract necessarily from the points being made in regards to Ukraine in this exact scenario, where they are calling for peace, for parties to sit down and to realize that this can't be a situation in which one party comes out with the entire advantage, right? Obviously, no one wants to see Russia coming out with the entirety of the Ukraine and anything else it wants, where it just gets to have free reign over Eastern Europe and whatever it may want to pick, protect, demilitarize, denazify. On the other hand, you really don't want a situation either where Ukraine gets 100% of its demands, where it can demand Crimea back, demand the entirety of the Donbass and the peoples within it, demand concessions among who's going to lead the Russian state and future economic ties, their nuclear stockpiles. I'm sure the list of what Ukraine would like, given ultimate authority, is long, lengthy, and ridiculous, as it would be for Russia, should they have 100% leveraging bargaining power here. But that is the position that the Biden administration said that it will need to achieve before it even considers peace. They have said, we need the wind at Zelensky's back. We need to be in a scenario where Zelensky can ask for anything at the negotiation table and receive that at the negotiation table. But the problem is that's not a negotiation table, right? That's a demands table at that point. Genuine negotiation comes when both sides have some form of leverage and desire to negotiate and sit down and come to a compromise, which of course is not going to be ideal for either state, but it is ideal compared to the Third World War or large-scale nuclear conflict. I'm sure we can all agree on that. And so to have these U.S. officials making this a black and white negotiation table removes the negotiation from the table. It's really the most frustrating part of hearing this foreign policy approach, is that they're not desiring to be peacemakers, they're desiring to be peace demanders. Those are different things. And the latter is not productive and is not reasonable to expect from another power, especially when that other power can tell you no with nukes. So that's a long way to say I understand the cynicism about prospects for peace. That is not to say they don't exist, and that is not to say there aren't things that we can do to push ourselves closer to that. If we have conversations like this and emphasize the real risk of nuclear war, if we emphasize the inevitable consequences to the global order, to the U.S. economic system, should we pursue this path, and particularly should we pursue this path and fail in our end efforts, peace is always going to be tricky. It's often going to be unpopular, but it is almost always the right pursuit. So,
yeah, and I am curious. I know we hit the hour mark, but I'm so interested in this, and I'm learning a lot here. So I do want to ask a couple more questions. As someone who has studied Russia for a while, do you perceive the nuclear threat to be real? Because the National Intelligence Director herself, as I said earlier, has said that if Putin feels he's about to lose the war, or if his regime is threatened, he will launch nukes. And I know that is the policy he expressed earlier this week. But there are other people who suggest that he would gain nothing from doing it, especially launching nothing in Ukraine itself. Can he be pushed to a point where he has nothing to lose?
Yes. And I don't come out with that yes so confidently because I think we're going to reach a point of nuclear conflict, but because that risk is very real and that decision could very well be made by Russian leadership in a variety of circumstances towards which we are currently pushing ourselves. For example, the Russian nuclear doctrine talks about their use in the event of an existential risk to Russia. And as we've said, they perceive several potential existential risks, both from this conflict and the larger NATO expansion, U.S. Western desire to push its hegemony further and further. They also talk about mass casualty incidents. Should there be some sort of mass casualty attack on definitively Russian soil? So let's say, somewhere like Belgorod, Moscow, St. Petersburg, they could, in theory, retaliate with a nuclear weapon. Now, the Biden administration has said, and I tend to agree with them on this, that the use of a strategic nuclear weapon is pretty much zero. It's remarkably low. But the use of a tactical nuclear weapon is still low, but it's higher. And I would agree with that assessment, that if they were to use a nuke, it would likely be a tactical nuke. And I think it likely would be in Ukraine, not anywhere else. Because these situations in which I see a nuke being used, once again, however slim the chances may be, would involve, let's say, some sort of large-scale, long-range Ukrainian strike into Crimea that just levels, a bunch of resorts there on the Crimean shore, kills a bunch of civilians there. That could very much be taken by Russian leadership as a mass casualty incident, and prompt them to tactically nuke whatever advancing direction of the Ukrainian army is trying to, move into Crimea. Should there be any sort of large-scale attack, let's say Ukraine garners lots of battlefield momentum and decides to push further into Russia. Let's say they try and forcibly depose Russian leadership somehow. These are all things that could be perceived, interpreted as an existential risk to Russia or a mass casualty incident on Russian soil. And, like I said with the Niet means Niet memo, we knew that we were going to fuck around, and we knew the chances of finding out were high. And it's similar to this, where we know what could happen, we know the odds, and we really shouldn't play them, but it kind of seems as though we may, which is the scary part, and why, thankfully, they are still rather low. I don't think Ukraine, unless perhaps Zelensky goes insane and thinks there's an existential risk to his regime, would he do something as ridiculous as like a large-scale strike on Crimea or into definitive Russian territory?
So I know that most nuclear war simulations begin with one strike and then an immediate response. I mean, do you think MAD as a theory is still legitimate? And I mean, I kind of have seen the Biden administration back away from a mutual assured destruction type thinking. Like there are some comments that make it clear that they wouldn't. I can't think of any offhand, but I remember hearing some comments earlier where they were pretty sure that it wouldn't build up into to be a larger nuclear conflict. So I'm curious if you have any ideas there, if you think that if they were to launch a tactical nuke in Crimea, would there be a response?
I'm going to quote a remarkably good and ahead of its time movie, and that is War Games. And that is the only winning move is not to play. I truly think they hit the nail on the head with that one. And that even in some crazy slim chance that the powers that be put a stop to the nuclear conflict before it escalates beyond the point of no return, so to speak, beyond that slim chance even, I think that we end up with something that we can't take back. Deploying nuclear weapons by modern states in this current day and age. Let's say, for example, that Russia does deploy a tactical nuke on Ukraine. I don't, in this scenario, this might be one of the few scenarios where I'm not positive or even confident that the US and the West would engage in its own nuclear response right away. I think they might launch an entirely total war, conventional war on Russia, as a punishment, as a consequence for nuking Ukraine, which then in and of itself, though, I think would be more likely to spiral into the nuclear conflict there, where, a single tactical nuke drop by Russia, I don't think we're going to start launching ICBMs 30 minutes from then. But the consequences of a tactical nuke use, I think, could boil over not long after. into full-blown nuclear warfare. And so I think it really is best that we adopt the idea that the only winning move is not to play. And it can be humiliating, right, not to play. It's especially as like, once you get into national fervor and patriotism, these are things that make you want to play the game. They make the game seem fun even. But with a rational and clear mind, anyone should realize that the game is not worth playing. Yeah. Because you're not playing life, but with millions, billions potentially, depending on the scale of the conflict that emerges. So I think it's important that we be humble and thoughtful as peacemakers, that we try and realize that there are going to be some ego hits, there are going to be some losses, there's going to be some mourning and some grief, but that's how we work through towards the best ultimate outcome, right? I was discussing with you earlier the Beatitudes from the Bible and how it's such a great synopsis of a solid foreign policy approach in many ways. It raves on about how blessed are the peacemakers, right? Blessed are those who are merciful, blessed are those who mourn, right? All of these things may compromise us in terms of our own ego, in terms of our national pride, but they are essential virtues to take to the negotiation table, to have as peacemakers. We can't go in there all prideful. We can't go in there with ill intent, with malice in our hearts. We have to go in there humble. We have to go in there merciful. We have to go in there with a sincere sense of righteousness, with a cause. And we have to go in there, as I've made the distinction, as peacemakers, not peace forcers, right? There is an important line there. And so I would encourage, the leaders of all these major powers. I know that, Biden at least is Catholic. Putin, celebrates in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Zelensky himself is of the Jewish faith. And so they can all look to the Bible, at least, even if, perhaps in one case, not to the New Testament, but look to these biblical virtues that are laid forth and realize that we should take them into our diplomacy and our foreign policy. We should be peacemakers so that we are blessed. We should be merciful and humble, meek, so that we can be blessed. Because if we don't, we bring ourselves to hell. And I mean that in the sense of nuclear Armageddon, the hell that we would wrought on Earth, as well as, depending on your belief, beyond now here on Earth. So I think it's all the more critical, that considered, that we focus not on any given side, country, victor, outcome, winner, except on the victory and the outcome of a successful peace that can lead to a more stable world. And that's where we circle back to, what does a stable world look like? What are the goalposts here on either side? And the goalpost of a unipolar, NATO-led US dollar world, to me, is not one where peace is going to be lasting and sustainable. You're going to run into the same problems that you run into this conflict. If this doesn't change the world order, is the Taiwan conflict going to? Are we going to handle that any differently? Or are we going to have a giant rerun of the same hell on earth warfare? Is this going to escalate into that because we refuse to settle it now? And so, although I, of course, as an American, I don't advocate multipolarity because I hate the West, because I hate America, but because I love it and I want to see it thrive and cooperate with the nations of the world to, as you said, be a city on a hill. And I want Russia to be a city on a hill too. I want China to become a city on the hill where they can hold up as virtuous, sincere examples of how they express their national identity, their own will as a people, and that they can do it positively and in hopes of bettering not only themselves with their light, but the world with their light by shining it. So if we just take some of these very basic moral, ethical principles and thoughts and apply them to how we approach seemingly very complex, given they are complex foreign policy scenarios, but we take these simple virtues and the pathway to peace and to stability become all the more clear. And so I think we can't discount very basic ways of thinking about peace, about what we would like to see from the world. Because if we get lost in the politics and the history too much, we lose what's at sight, which is humanity, our souls, our consciousness, our hearts, because ultimately this conflict is going to have an impact on all those things throughout the globe. I think both sides have been right in that this conflict is symbolic of a larger battle in the global consciousness, a larger battle in the global hive mind, so to speak, as where different conflicting views are having to reconcile, unfortunately through violence, but hopefully eventually through peace, through negotiation, through the word. I think you're muted, Liam, if I'm not mistaken, unless it's my end.
Nope, it was my end. Yeah, I was just going to say, to go back to your point about whether we should respond during a nuclear strike. I actually remember the quote. It was Boris Johnson. He said that if Putin were to launch a nuke, we would have enough economic responses. I think it would be like sanctions and blockades, where a nuclear response wouldn't be necessary. That I think he threatened that Russia would become like a frozen wasteland. I forget the exact terminology that he used.
Well, it's funny given that Russia's projected to grow more than the UK economically, despite all the sanctions. So
exactly,
well, it's a bold claim when you have those chips in your hand, cards in your hand.
Yeah, and not despite the sanctions for UK. I mean, partially it's responsible for why the UK and Europe is in the state that it is economically.
Yeah, we didn't even touch Nord Stream or any of the developments from Seymour Hersh and all that, but I'm assuming a lot of the viewership is familiar with that blatant provocation, so not much need to link there. But
there's so much here. There's so much here, and we could keep going on. And I do want to get to one of the questions that was submitted, but really quick, I do kind of have like an appeal for like optimism, I guess. So the optimism, I think if this war were to end, unfortunately, I think it would be because we would get to a position in Europe where we're at a situation where a lot of these NATO countries start pushing back because there's a lot of protests. And we saw in the United States, there was the anti-war protest in DC last weekend, and there was a corresponding one in Germany where there were thousands of people that showed up. Yeah. And I think that that's probably the avenue here. I don't think it's going to come out of the Biden administration. And a lot can happen before. What was that?
It doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, and a lot can happen before November 2024, which is terrifying to think of. So I think this is really going to have to be an organic thing, having conversations like this. And thankfully, we have decentralized media where we're able to spread these ideas. And I think that it is taking hold. I think that there's also another. Actually, I'm going to pivot to the question because it's related to this. These ideas are taking hold, and we're seeing it in Congress with Matt Gaetz introducing the Ukraine resolution or I think it was actually Rosendale, and it was a resolution to pull out of Ukraine while we or until we fund the border and protect the border. So Isaac Nelson, he's asking, when speaking on inflation and the United States national debt, do you think with the new House leadership, and especially Rosendale's promise to push for a balanced budget and the opposition to increasing our debt ceiling, will that impact our spending on Ukraine, or will the Democrats simply brush this off?
That is a good question. And to touch on where the debt ceiling stands and plays into this, for those who aren't familiar, we are set to default on our debts as our financial obligations as a nation. I believe it's in June or maybe July now, given their measures that they've taken at the Treasury. But this summer, we are set to default on our debt and financial obligations, essentially because Congress is seemingly refusing to raise the debt ceiling due to concerns that every time you raise the debt ceiling, you are committing an economic sin of sorts and setting yourself up for a bigger and bigger failure the longer that you let this debt pile up. It's been a very common point of contention in Congress. It's usually at the last minute resolved and the debt ceiling is raised. And in this case, I don't know how much of an impact it would have immediately on aid to Ukraine. the Biden administration, the Pentagon, has said that their big package at the end of last year in December, their omnibus spending package, pretty much covers them through the end of this fiscal year, after which point they would need to go through another process, get more funding from Congress. But they do seem pretty confident that at their current pace and trajectory of aid, they're covered until we need to pass a new budget. Now, the question becomes, if we have to shut down as a government, if Congress can never agree to a raise of the debt ceiling, they can't, authorize, get more money printed to pursue more Ukraine aid. So then it can become an issue. But short term, I don't think that the shenanigans in Congress are going to be all that impactful. Although I've mentioned that there is a sizable Republican House opposition to endless Ukraine aid, the Senate Republicans are sadly not so aligned on the issue. And so with Republican support, neocons and Democrats aboard the Ukraine train in the House, they're able to pass most aid they'll want to. Similarly, in the Senate, they'll pretty much pass whatever Ukraine aid they want to without much objection, besides from figures like Rand Paul, for example. And so, as sad as it is to say, I don't think Congress is going to be the thing that budges, at least short term. Now, as we get closer to 2024 is where we might start seeing true political pressure from the bases as complaints and worries and economic consequences start to pile up. If we are still dragging out and still bearing further and further consequences, almost just skyrocketing faster than we can control at a certain point, then it's going to become an issue, because people are going to start voting at the ballot box, and they're going to vote people out of office who they think are placing Ukraine's interest above their own as a constituent of whatever lawmaker it may be.
Yeah,
that was a good question. So I hope that answers it, despite probably being not satisfactory.
Yeah, and related to your answer, we saw Trump come out with a video, like a 3-4 minute video the other day, where he was saying that he was going to gut the Pentagon and the State Department of warmongers. Okay. Yeah, and then he specifically called out Newland, which was great to see. So it is awesome to see that it is becoming more mainstream to call out neoconservative policies. And I just hope that they extend that to China, because, I mean, a lot of the times it's because they want to pivot to China that they're expressing these beliefs in regards to Russia. They're able to see that when the West steps on the scale and benefits Ukraine, it incentivizes Ukraine to become more belligerent and for Russia to escalate as well. But unfortunately, they don't recognize that same dynamic in Taiwan. And we just escalated the National Guard and troop presence in Taiwan. And China is increasing their military drills in the area as a result. And their response always corresponds with more U.S. presence in Taiwan. And something I thought of in your last answer, and I'm going to wrap up here, but we didn't even get to the fact that Naftali Bennett, the previous Israeli prime minister, came out a little bit ago and said that the West actually got interfered with talks between Ukraine and Russia, and how Putin had put on the table that he would get rid of the requirements to demilitarize Ukraine, and he would also get rid of the requirement to denazify Ukraine if Ukraine put on the table that they would remain neutral and stay out of NATO. And Ukraine had agreed to do that as well. And the West got involved. And we know Boris Johnson also interfered earlier. He traveled to Ukraine and interfered in peace talks. Merkel came out and said that even the Minsk agreements were just temporary band-aids because they were just preparing for larger conflict. So if just to throw some more black pills out there, I did want to finish with some spiritual advice too, some maybe Christian stoicism, as you kind of did with the Beatitudes. I'm going to read some C.S. Lewis. I've read this on some other podcasts before, but I think that this is very important. both from a libertarian and a Christian perspective, I think that you can gain some wisdom, even if you're a non-believer here, just with your approach to Stoic life and, not letting things that you can't control, get to you. And this is an essay that was written by C.S. Lewis in regards to the atomic age. And I'm going to just read this passage. It's a little lengthy, but I do think it is important, and it's kind of a good way to wrap up.
I'm excited.
So what was that?
Oh, I'm excited to hear it. I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis quotes, so I'm curious which one you're pulling out.
Yeah, and I've used this in articles before and other podcasts, so listeners might be annoyed that I'm reading it again, but I think it's so important, and I constantly need to remind myself because I am fear-mongering a lot, and I am very worried about the risk of nuclear weapons being used, but I have to remind myself that I am saved, and here's the quote. So C.S. Lewis, he was asked a question, how should we live in an atomic age? And he says, I am tempted to reply, why, as you would have lived in the 16th century when the plague visited London almost every year, or as you would have lived in the Viking age when raiders from Scandinavia might land and cut your throat any night, or indeed as you are already living in an age of cancer, an age of syphilis, an age of paralysis, an age of air raids, an age of railway accidents, an age of motor accidents. In other words, do not let us begin by exaggerating the novelty of our situation. Believe me, dear sir, madam, you and all whom you love were already sentenced to death before the atomic bomb was invented. And quite a high percentage of us were going to die in unpleasant ways. We had indeed one very great advantage over our ancestors, anesthetics, but we have that still. It is perfectly ridiculous to go about whimpering and drawing long faces because the scientists have added one more chance of painful and premature death to a world which already bristled with such chances, and in which death itself was not a chance at all, but a certainty. This is the first point to be made. And the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are all going to be destroyed by an atomic bomb, let that bomb, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Praying, working, teaching, reading, listening to music, bathing the children, playing tennis, chatting to our friends over a pint and a game of darts, not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about bombs. They may break our bodies, a microbe can do that, but they need not dominate our minds. And I really think that this kind of gets to, for us libertarians, it gets to the idea that there's actually liberty in kind of what Paul was talking about, this Christian liberty where our state of mind can actually free us. If we approach life in a Christian Stoic kind of way, I could be a slave, but I could be more free than my master. If my master is, enslaved by his desires and enslaved by me as a slave, and he is dependent on my work for him, is he more a slave than I am if I am free spiritually? And I think that is some serious advice that I need to remind myself of often. I freak out about the fact that our leaders may drive us into nuclear war, but at the same time, I try to be at peace internally. And I guarantee you, many of these people at these high levels of government are not, and we should pray for them for that, I think.
That's beautifully put, and it's an issue that I personally love as well. This idea of inner liberty, ascetic liberty, as one of my favorite thinkers, Sorokin, put it. And I know we talk so much about the Russia-Ukraine conflict in our recent podcast. I'd love to come back in the future for a show just on libertarian philosophy, ethics, links to Christianity and other schools of thought. It would be a lovely conversation because there is so much of a broader discussion to be had about life and humankind than just these particular issues and their consequences. But as you've aptly pointed out, they are ultimately super connected. A solid conscience and a good heart and a good soul can remain and withstand through the most tumultuous of times and global circumstances, so long as it does not get corrupted by overthinking about these global circumstances. I don't think the human mind has fully adapted to worrying about global news cycles, even national news cycles quite yet. We are very localized beings from an evolutionary sense. And so learning how to responsibly handle emotions and actions when it comes to a conflict thousands of miles away, we can't entirely blame ourselves for not handling it perfectly, because there is a learning curve for sure. But we can't stop trying to learn and improve as students of, the rulers of the planet, the rulers of our destinies. We have to take responsibility as responsible human beings. I've talked about how this conflict is wrapped in a larger battle for the global consciousness, the noosphere, how we're going to handle ourselves as interconnected, networked beings. And you can't start diving into those questions just with politics and history. You have to get to philosophy, ethics, more theoretical, abstract, esoteric matters. And I know we want to wrap up here. We're just at 90 minutes, which is, absolutely perfect. Attention spans are fried. So if people make it this far, I'm pleased. But I saw a great tweet, and I love complex systems. I have to share this thought that tank warfare is technically an emergent property of complex biological systems. We're adaptive complex systems, and we have evolved into tank warfare just as a matter of fact. But the beauty of complex adaptive systems, right, is that they're feedback loops. We have inputs, outputs, feedback, and it all goes again. And in this case, the feedback, the response to this conflict in our behaviors should be to better them, should be to understand from the mistake, to create good and shine light out of the dark and evil that we may find ourselves in. And so although we may have naturally come into war and we may be warlike beings who are just absolute beasts sometimes, the conflict then also provides the perfect opportunity to figure out how to transform beyond that. And so not only should we be peacemakers for the sake of making peace and saving lives now, but so that we may learn how to do it better in the future. And I think that is a great, you put me up perfectly for that ending message. So I appreciate it, Liam.
Yeah, of course. And paradoxically, if we do take C.S. Lewis's advice and we, kind of almost retreat, I don't think we have to throw off all responsibility and not call out our leaders when they step out of line. But if we focus on the things that matter locally, and we focus on our family, we focus on the, bettering ourselves, taking responsibility, it will impact the world. It has this network effect, as you suggested, where it will reverberate. If we impact our family around us and our network around us, hopefully, if everyone were to take C.S. Lewis's advice, we'd live in a peaceful world.
If we localize our why, the how will be apparent to all. I think is a really good. I think you hit the nail on the head there. If we can drive the messages for why war is bad and peace is good, and make its benefits tangible to the people closest to us, it's going to have, as you said, paradoxically, the most global impact. So,
well, we'll wrap up there. Do you just want to tell people where they can find your stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I encourage everyone to give me and Liam, if you haven't already, a follow on Twitter. I'm at _posts from underground, homage to Dostoevsky in that title. Be on the lookout for any future content I may put forward. I'm a busy individual, as you can imagine, with the ongoing conflict which I focus on. But taking C.S. Lewis's advice, I might need to put my mind towards other things more frequently. So follow me, find out.
All right, everyone. And make sure to tune back to my podcast with Darren Gobb from Wednesday, where we discuss the Defend the Guard Act. It's coming up on Monday. A serious reason we need to vote for this bill and make sure it gets through the legislature and to the governor's desk is because Biden is clearly escalating this war. We might send troops there. It seems like that's where that's heading. Unfortunately, I think also a draft might follow because retainment and recruitment are low. And we need Congress to go on record if they are going to send our troops to this conflict. So if we pass the Defend the Guard Act, it will require Congress to vote in favor of the war if they want to send our National Guard troops to Ukraine to fight in this conflict and any future conflicts that will follow. So please check that out. Remember to subscribe. Check this podcast out on other platforms as well. I'm on Odyssey. I think I'm on Rumble and all the audio podcatchers. So remember to follow me at mliammccall on Twitter, and then I'll have the other links in the description soon. But thanks for everyone who is listening. Make sure to give it a like and subscribe.